So, chronic illness as a stuck set point. I'm going to be talking about cybernetics and medicine. The impetus for this was a paper, a preprint that came out from Thomas Pollak and Mike Levin about a week ago. So it's really, really fresh. But by the end of this talk, you should understand first what I mean, what people mean when we say set point in the context of health. You should understand what the reset mechanism is, and also why this is actually such an important idea right now. So brief context, my name is Max Chen. I studied computational cognitive science at MIT, and I keep doing this research, and I also coach people who have pain and different types of illnesses. So let me bring you back to the eve of the 1900s. If you were a young person, particularly a young man in Vienna, about 1 in 5 of your friends would have, anyone recognize what this is? Syphilis, yes. It was a sexually transmitted infection. It was a bacteria that would start to spread over your body, and it had a really high mortality rate. A lot of people died from syphilis, and there was a sense in the medical community in the 1910s of a deep nihilism because they couldn't do anything. There was this disease plaguing all of Europe, and they were just helpless. One day, there's this young German psychiatrist who starts to notice that actually in some cases, these people would have syphilis and they'd start to go crazy and have these sores appear on their body. But he noticed that some of these patients actually got better after a period of getting more sick. And malaria was actually pretty prominent in Europe at the time still too. And he somehow made this link. Maybe a secondary infection was linked with them getting better. And so in an utter move of insanity, in hindsight, he had his malaria patients in this room, and he had his syphilis patients in this room. And for his late-stage syphilis patients, he would go to the malaria patients, draw their blood, and he would inject it into the syphilis patients. And there was a war investigation or a criminal investigation into his practice, but the insane thing is that it worked, and he won the Nobel Prize. In 1927, the Nobel Prize was awarded to Julius Wagner-Jurek for exactly this. Now, he didn't explain how it worked. In fact, there still isn't a good, quote unquote, adequate explanation, but it clearly worked. And even though 10 to 15% of people would die from malaria, a larger fraction would live from what would be previously a death sentence, a late-stage syphilis. And so just to pause a little bit for why this is so radical, at the time, this, what we call the biomedical model of reasoning was really prevalent. This basically shouldn't make sense. How do you give someone something that makes them more sick and yet they become better? The biomedical reasoning at the time is that our diseases have specific causes. There's a specific physiological dysfunction. So if you have diphtheria, which is a bacterium that lines your lungs, there is a bacterium and you kill it either through antibiotics or giving some kind of antitoxin to address the toxins in your body. Also, nowadays, how do we treat heart disease? Well, heart disease is your coronary arteries get clogged, and so you go in there and you widen them. That's how you fix it, right? We're like biomechanical machines. And the malaria example isn't unique in some kind of a seemingly unrelated intervention leading to a resolution. There's a lot of different cases here. And here I want to live in the question with you all because this is emerging and alive, and the patterns are here for us to explore and elaborate. So in the case of long COVID and other post-viral infections, there's been well-documented similar cases of a secondary infection leading to resolution. In my own practice and experience, there's many cases where seemingly unrelated practices that revolve around your nervous system and paying attention to your symptoms that also lead to resolution of these post-infectious disease symptoms. Similarly, you probably have come across the MDMA trials and psychedelics for post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. And so that's another case in which it's not like MDMA disrupts the thing that's causing depression in your mind, or it somehow removes the toxin that creates the PTSD. There's something else going on here. And similarly, chronic pain, as the long COVID symptoms, there's nervous system reprocessing stuff that really does help with it. And just to emphasize how radical this perspective is, in 2021, the Congress authorized the NIH to spend $1.5 billion to research long COVID, but it was done in such a way that it was all about the biochemical pathology of long COVID. So it was looking into all of the chemical signatures, and I was in touch with a PI at Harvard, Mike Danino, who does research on long COVID, but from the nervous system perspective. And the grant was written in such a way that it systematically excluded him from applying for any of this funding. So, okay, so there are these weird examples of things that don't quite make sense within the biomedical model. Then what is the alternative model? The alternative model is to embrace what has been pervading all of engineering and all of other sciences, and to start to think about chronic illness in terms of feedback loops, and specifically set points and priors. And I'm going to unpack this to make it clear, because there's a lot that's baked into this sentence. The older way of thinking is trying to characterize the body as this series of chained chemical reactions. This is the diagram for interferon, the chemical pathway that's involved in a response to a viral infection. This is kind of how implicitly a lot of medical science sees our bodies reacting to things. There's just super detailed charts with chemical reactions. What I want to argue, and what this paper argues, is that we should transition from seeing the body purely in terms of these chemical reactions towards something more like this, where the body is moving in state spaces and solving problems and stuck in local minimas and local maximums. And this is going to become more concrete for you shortly. Let me go and then you can ask. So yeah, old, body's a collection of biochemical pathways. New, the body is a multi-scale collective intelligence that solves problems at different layers, from the cell to the organ system to your whole being. And if you read the paper, you'll see used interchangeably a couple of different terms. So people will say prior or probabilistic prior, but that we're using them loosely, kind of synonymously with attractor and set point. And here, all of that is about a point in a valley. So I want to make this embodied for all of us. The body wants to keep us in a range of relatively safe values. We call this the homeostatic impulse. In the case of our breathing, there's a comfortable rate at which we want to breathe, and when we adjust from that, it becomes uncomfortable. So if anyone is willing to run a 60-second experiment, without, only if you're comfortable, just follow my guidance. On the next exhale, just stop yourself from inhaling and notice what the feelings are that are coming up in you. And just pause and feel that tension rising. And notice where it's coming from in your body. And then if you need to, of course, let yourself inhale, but just really feel that. Notice how there's this discomfort, this urge to inhale, your heart rate is changing, and there's almost a sense of panic when you start to hold your breath for long enough. Let yourself breathe easily and smoothly. But that's what the homeostatic impulse feels like, right? When you don't let yourself hold your breath, all of these systems kick into play. You'll notice that there's muscle contractions, that your throat might tighten, your blood vessels might dilate, and there starts to be this emotional movement inside. So that's what the homeostatic impulse feels like. And it's happening at different scales, just like there's this emotional aspect to it. There's the muscles in your throat that tighten. There's your lungs that are involved. So there's this homeostatic impulse that we have that exists. It's very, 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 very deep, and it exists across many different systems and scales. This homeostatic set point, right now you're probably breathing at around 13 to 15 breaths a minute. This set point can change depending on your context. So if you start to run and you're jogging at a comfortably aerobic rate, you will have a higher breathing rate, and the oxygen level in your tissues are roughly maintained. If you are in a chronically stressful job, you may find that your breathing pattern alters and you continue to take shallow breaths that are faster. And paradoxically, we can see that sometimes the tissue, the level of oxygen in your tissues can decrease when that's persistent over a long time. And the core idea of this whole paper is that sometimes our bodies can get stuck in these maladaptive states. So another experiment, if you're open to it, you try to clench your abs like something's about to penetrate. And as you feel the clenched abs, notice your breathing. How hard is it to breathe now?
Harder.
It's harder to breathe. Yeah, and relax the clenched abs, and then notice as you relax what changes in your breath and what changes in the rest of your body. Did you say something?
My breaths are deeper.
Yeah. There's a sense of, ease and comfort, and maybe the sense that you're able to use more of your body because your abs aren't clenched. You can imagine that if you were walking around all the time with your abs clenched, your breathing would be persistently different, and that would affect all sorts of things too. And when you have a state of chronic stress or kind of chronic fight or flight, that is what it feels like, but you can forget that you're clenching your abs and that you're clenching other parts of your body. And that would be an example, a felt sense of what it's like for your body to become stuck in this maladaptive set point. And just briefly, we can gesture and start to make sense of these different conditions as related to these set points. So with post-infectious syndromes like long COVID, we can see that the body is locked up and engaged in this chronic defensive mode. And something similar happens with chronic pain. With PTSD, there can be this sense of constant vigilance where subtle changes that shouldn't indicate a danger in a safe society lead to a really intense reaction. And other things like anorexia and obesity can also be understood in terms of set points. Actually, a lot of different cases in health start to make sense when we start to think about set points, including depression and anxiety, for instance. The broader thing that's interesting here is that we talk about these as separate things. We talk about pain and post-infectious syndromes as like their own cluster of things, but if we take this model seriously, I think we can start to see that they're unified in some shape, where the pain, the anxiety, the discomfort is a symptom or downstream of this set point that has been perturbed or altered. So this was the setup for the main claim, the main point that this paper talks about, which is switching it on and off again. So has anyone noticed that sometimes when your computer is broken and you are trying very hard to debug things, the thing that reliably kind of works is that you turn it on and off again? Has anyone noticed that? That was the underlying metaphor that motivated this paper. Somehow in network systems, when we turn things on and off again, they seem to work. And what do we mean by reset here? Here we basically mean some kind of a perturbation in an environment that isn't necessarily directed towards the healthier thing, but where the system begins to recalibrate as a response. So in terms of our kind of valley metaphor, what we want to say is that there is a period of plasticity where the state of the body can start to shift without as much energy. So we can vaguely think about this impressionistic valleys as the amount of energy that it takes to move the system, the bodily state, from one valley to another. In a chronic illness condition, it can be infeasible, the level of change, or it can seem infeasible how far it is to get to health from the illness. But in the context of a reset, this perturbation, what can happen is that this valley significantly decreases. And so it becomes much easier for the body to coordinate and to move from this state of illness into health. And we actually already see many examples of the reset in medical practice. When you are having a heart attack, one of the things that emergency responders will do is to bring a set of electrodes and shock your body with a really high voltage. It's not that they're teaching your heart how to beat again with a precise, calibrated way of beating. It's this intense shock. And when your heart is beating with different rhythms and the contraction and the relaxation isn't in sync, this shock is enough to allow the tissues to recalibrate. Obviously, the mechanisms of the heart is not my area of expertise, but for the fecal transplants, something similar happens too. We take gut microbiome from someone that's healthy, and you might grind it up and then you give someone a pill that is basically someone else's poo pill, and they digest it, and what we think happens is actually that the whole microbiome of the sick person gets overwhelmed with the new bacteria, and then there is kind of a reset where their old bacteria begin to repopulate in a more healthy proportion. To circle back to what we talked about at the beginning, can we understand some of these other interventions as types of resets? So with long COVID, having a secondary infection feels clearly similar to that. But maybe also some of this nervous system reprocessing. I like to think about working with the nervous system as decreasing the valleys and the gulf between illness and health, and making it require less energy for the body to move between those states. And you can think about exposure as a type of little perturbation too. If you're chronically afraid of spiders, in small doses there's a perturbation to the system, and in the safe context this adjustment can happen. And similarly, MDMA and psychedelics, there's a big section on the paper that's really clear about this, can be understood as resetting the landscape and flattening the landscape so that the body can begin to move. There's a great paper by Friston and Carhart-Harris about precisely this metaphor in psychedelics called Relaxed Beliefs Under Uncertainty. Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics, the Rebus paper. So the underlying sense of what we're getting at is acknowledging that our body is not some dumb set of pathways, but actually a deeply intelligent, multi-scale problem-solving system that tends towards health, but that we might just need the right context to allow this reset to happen and this scaffolding to do so in a way that's safe. It's not just about shocking someone. It's actually about understanding the magnitude of that shock, what happens afterwards and what happens before. The context is just as important as the shock itself, as they emphasize in the paper. And so as I'm starting to wrap this up and leave you with, this is all still really fresh. We are talking about set points and the body moving through different states, and we have a simple language, but we still need to really articulate what this means. In the case of the blood oxygen, for example, it makes some impressionistic sense, but what exactly are these variables, and can we start to get a little bit more clear about the quantities involved? Can we start to measure some of these things? Another question I have that's really rich and open is how our own cognitive attention relates to the plasticity. So there's a big thing in the therapeutic literature around this mechanism of memory reconsolidation. It's supposed to be the super mechanism that explains all types of therapies, where you bring the thing into awareness and only then can it change. I think that there's something really interesting where if you become aware of the way that your body is defending, that can actually flatten the landscape and allow you to change. And then finally, a really big practical thing is when we are trying to get ourselves out of these resets, what are the ingredients of what makes a helpful reset and what doesn't? How does that change across different contexts? And so now you have a sense of what I mean by a set point. You have a sense of what a reset is, and hopefully you also get a feeling of how this is just a really different way of seeing than is common in the practice of medicine today, and how we may begin to broaden, explore, and flesh out this paradigm. I, for one, am really, really excited about where this is leading. If any of you all are interested in reading more, finding out more about it, I have a podcast called Pain Points and a newsletter here. But yeah, really glad to share this kind of seed of a new idea, a new paradigm with you all. And let's have a discussion after.